The cold wind howled through the nearly empty parking lot, whipping dried leaves across the cracked pavement. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting long, ghostly shadows over the parked cars. It was late, later than Olivia had planned to stay out. But between the nausea that came in waves and the dull ache in her lower back, she'd had to stop more times than she wanted. 7 months along, and even the simplest errands had become exhausting. She exhaled sharply, adjusting the strap of her duffel bag over her shoulder. The weight of it pressed against her sore muscles, but she was used to that kind of discomfort. Pain, strain, and discipline had been constants in her life long before pregnancy. Before she had traded combat boots for maternity jeans, she had been a force to be reckoned with, one of the country's best canine trainers. Not just for obedience, not for show. Her dogs were warriors, veterans of war, trained in tactics that most people couldn't even fathom. And tonight, they waited in the back of her SUV, silent and watchful, as she made her way across the dimly lit lot. The gas station convenience store behind her buzzed with activity. Rowdy laughter spilling from the entrance, the acrid smell of cigarettes hanging in the air. She ignored it at first, keeping her focus ahead. But a sudden hush followed her footsteps, a shift in the energy, that kind of silence that crawled over your skin, warning you before your brain even fully processed what was happening. Olivia glanced toward the group of men leaning against the store's outer wall. 5 of them, all young, dressed in a mix of sagging jeans and thick hoodies. One had a cigarette hanging lazily from his lips. Another, a scar cutting across his cheek, had his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes locked onto her like a predator studying prey. Her gut clenched. She had been in enough dangerous situations to know when she was being sized up. Still, she kept walking. Her breath came steady, her pace unhurried. If she tensed up, if she showed fear, it would give them what they wanted. So she reached her SUV, her fingers curling around the handle. But before she could open it, "Hey, Mama, need a hand?" The voice was laced with mock sweetness, but Olivia didn't turn. She kept her grip firm on the handle, the cold metal grounding her. Another voice, lower and rougher, chuckled. "She's got enough hands, bro. Probably got knocked up by some soldier boy. Ain't that right, sweetheart?" Heat prickled the back of Olivia's neck, but she didn't react. She had dealt with their kind before. Men who mistook her silence for weakness. Men who saw a woman alone and assumed she was an easy target. A step. Then another. They were closing in. Olivia inhaled deeply. A shift in her stance, almost imperceptible, but calculated. Her body angled slightly toward them now, no longer just a woman trying to avoid trouble, but something else. Something they couldn't quite put their finger on yet. "Come on, we're just being friendly," the scarred one said, moving to block her from the driver's side. His grin was slow, lazy, the kind that thought it had all the time in the world. But Olivia's patience was wearing thin. Inside the SUV, barely visible through the tinted windows, something shifted. A low, nearly inaudible sound rumbled through the air, a vibration more than a noise. Her dogs had been waiting, watching, their instincts sharper than any human's, and they had picked up what she already knew. Danger. But the men, they had no idea what was about to happen. Olivia's fingers tightened around the SUV handle, her mind sharpening into the kind of focus that had been drilled into her for years. Combat training wasn't just about force. It was about reading the room, understanding your enemy, and knowing exactly when to strike. These men thought she was just another woman, alone and vulnerable. They had no idea they were standing on the edge of a very dangerous line. Inside the vehicle, her dogs remained silent, but she could feel them, watching, waiting. They wouldn't act until she gave the signal. They had been trained that way, honed by years of service alongside elite military units. These weren't just pets. They were highly disciplined warriors. But before she did anything reckless, Olivia needed to weigh her options. Her body was no longer just her own. She was carrying a life inside of her. 7 months ago, she would have handled this situation without hesitation. A few words, a warning glance, maybe a well-placed strike to remind them they were out of their depth. But now, she had to be smarter, She wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She forced herself to relax her shoulders, keeping her tone even. I don't need help. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The scarred man stepped closer, his grin widening. "Ah, come on now. No need to be rude. We just want to chat." Olivia could smell the alcohol on his breath. It mixed with the stale cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, the scent of cheap cologne doing nothing to cover up the filth underneath. She was about to respond when a new voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" It was firm, steady, an older man's voice. Olivia turned slightly, just enough to see the gas station clerk standing at the entrance. He was in his 60s, wiry but strong-looking, his face lined with years of hard work. A name tag on his blue shirt read, Jim. His eyes, dark and sharp, flicked between Olivia and the men surrounding her. Scarface sneered. Just being friendly. Jim didn't buy it. Didn't sound friendly. For a moment, the two men locked eyes. Olivia recognized what was happening. Jim wasn't young, but he was old enough to have seen his share of trouble, and he wasn't afraid to stand in its way. The leader of the group let out a low chuckle, but there was no real humor in it. More like irritation. "Relax, old man, we're just talking." Jim didn't move, then talk somewhere else. A thick silence settled in the air. The rest of the men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. They had expected an easy night, maybe a laugh at her expense, maybe something more. But now there were too many variables. Scarface's eyes flicked back to Olivia, still calculating, still deciding. She met his gaze without flinching. That was when something changed. A flicker of something. Hesitation, maybe. He wasn't used to this. Not the lack of fear, not the calm way she was staring him down, as if she had already figured out how this would end. And maybe, just maybe, he started to wonder if she wasn't the one in danger. After a long pause, he scoffed and stepped back. "Forget it. Let's go." His friends hesitated for only a second before following, their footsteps crunching over loose gravel as they walked off into the night. Only when they were out of sight did Olivia finally exhale. Jim watched them go, then turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded, feeling the tension in her muscles slowly unwind. "Yeah, thanks." Jim studied her for a moment, as if trying to piece together her story. Then, he jerked his chin toward the SUV. "Those yours?" Olivia followed his gaze and saw what he meant. Her dogs, no longer hidden in the dark, had moved to the window. They weren't barking, they weren't growling, but their eyes, sharp, alert, had been locked onto the men the entire time. She allowed herself the smallest smirk. "Yeah, they're mine." Jim let out a low whistle. "They don't look like the kind you take to dog parks." Olivia chuckled, shaking her head. "No, they're not." There was something in Jim's expression, respect maybe, or curiosity, but he didn't press, he simply nodded. "Well, you take care now." With that, he turned and went back inside, leaving Olivia alone in the cold night air. She opened the SUV door and slid into the driver's seat, the warmth of the interior immediately soothing her chilled skin. Instantly, the dogs shifted. One of them, Ghostigu, a massive Belgian Malinois, climbed into the passenger seat, his golden brown eyes locked onto her face. The other, Rex, remained in the back, ears perked. Olivia reached out, running a hand over Ghost's head. "Good boys," she murmured. He leaned into her touch, his body still tense. He had been waiting for a command, ready to act the moment she needed him, but she hadn't given it. And that was what separated them from ordinary dogs. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, exhaustion creeping in. Memories surfaced, flashes of training fields, military bases, long nights spent alongside men and women who had trusted her to shape these animals into the ultimate protectors. She thought of Daniel, her husband, the man who had once stood beside her through it all, who had believed in what she did and the power of what these animals were capable of. He had always said that a good dog wasn't just a tool. It was a partner, a soldier in its own right. He had been right, and then just like that, the memory turned sour. Daniel was gone. Not because of war, not because of combat, but because life was cruel in ways she had never expected. A car accident. A single moment of miscalculation on a rainy road. 1 second, he had been beside her, laughing, his hand resting on hers. The next, she pushed the thought away. Not now. Not here. Instead, she let out a slow breath, grounding herself in the present. She glanced at Ghost, whose unwavering gaze was still locked onto her, sensing her unease. "I'm okay," she told him softly. He didn't move. Olivia shook her head, a wry smile ghosting her lips. "Liar," she muttered under her breath. She put the SUV in drive, pulling out of the parking lot. The road stretched before her, dark and empty, the streetlights casting faint halos of light on the asphalt. She needed to get home, to rest. But something gnawed at the back of her mind. A feeling. A warning. She checked her rearview mirror, and that was when she saw it. A car. Trailing behind her. At first it seemed like nothing. Just another driver heading in the same direction. But when she made her first turn, they turned too. Then another, and another. A slow, creeping chill ran down her spine. This wasn't over. Not yet. The glow of the streetlights cast eerie shadows across the road as Olivia tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The car behind her hadn't backed off. Every turn she made, every lane she switched, they mirrored her movements like a ghost in the dark. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe. Don't panic. Assess, plan, execute. She had been trained for situations like this, but back then, she had a squad, a weapon at her hip, and the certainty that backup was a radio call away. Now, she was alone. 7 months pregnant, and unarmed. But she wasn't defenseless. She glanced at the rearview mirror again. The car, a beat-up black sedan with one dimmed headlight, hung back just far enough to avoid suspicion from an untrained eye. But Olivia knew better. This wasn't coincidence. This was a tale. Ghost whined softly from the passenger seat, sensing her tension. In the back, Rex's ears flicked up, his body shifting slightly, prepared to react. They could feel the shift in the air, the creeping unease that clung to their owner. Olivia exhaled and weighed her options. She could drive straight home, but if they were following her, that would be a mistake. She wasn't about to lead potential trouble to her doorstep. Instead, she made an abrupt right turn onto a quieter street, a route that led toward an industrial area. If they followed, she would have her answer. The sedan turned, a deliberate choice. No hesitation. Her gut clenched. They're definitely following me. She spotted an empty parking lot up ahead, dimly lit and surrounded by chain-link fencing. It was isolated, no witnesses. Dangerous for her, but also for them, because they had no idea what they were walking into. She took the turn sharply, her tires crunching against loose gravel as she pulled into the lot. Then, without hesitation, she killed the engine. Silence. The black sedan slowed at the entrance, its headlights illuminating her SUV like a spotlight. Then the driver's side door opened, and Scarface stepped out. A slow smile stretched across his lips, his eyes glinting with amusement. His buddies had scattered earlier, but clearly he wasn't done with her. He had followed her alone. That meant one of two things. Either he was trying to intimidate her, or he thought he could handle her by himself. Bad call. Olivia didn't move as he sauntered forward, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets, his posture oozing fake confidence. He thought he was in control. He wasn't. "You sure do drive fast for someone carrying extra weight," he commented, tilting his head toward her stomach. She said nothing, just kept her breathing steady. Scarface took another step closer, now, only a few feet away from her driver's side door. He smirked. Got a little spooked back there, huh? Thought we were gonna hurt you? Still, Olivia didn't react. Let him think what he wanted. Let him dig his own grave. You see, he continued, I don't like being dismissed, especially not by some knocked-up chick who thinks she's better than me. His smirk disappeared, his eyes hardening. I don't like being disrespected. There it was. The real reason he was here. It wasn't about robbery or anything else. It was about ego. He was the kind of man who needed to win, needed to feel like he had power over others, especially women. Olivia had stripped him of that in the parking lot earlier. Now he wanted it back. Her fingers hovered over the door handle. She could end this right now. Quick, efficient, tactical. But something inside her held back. Think. Don't just react. Scarface took one more step now right outside her door. He leaned down, grinning through the window. And that's when Olivia finally moved. She reached across, pressed a button, and the doors unlocked with a soft click. Scarface's grin widened. That's more like it. He reached for the handle. The moment he pulled the door open, two things happened simultaneously. Ghost lunged. Rex launched from the back seat. Scarface barely had time to process what was happening before Nangsa 100. And 50 pounds of pure muscle and trained aggression hit him like a freight train. He hit the ground hard, his head smacking against the gravel with a sickening thud. Before he could even cry out, Ghost was on him, his massive paws pinning Scarface's chest. Sharp teeth bared inches from his throat. Rex circled around, blocking any possible escape. A low, rumbling growl vibrating from his chest. For the first time that night, Scarface's mask of arrogance shattered. His hands trembled. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared up at Ghost's gleaming fangs. Holy. Move, Olivia finally spoke, her voice like steel. And he rips out your throat. Scarface didn't move, didn't even breathe too hard. Olivia stepped out of the SUV, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off the last bit of tension. She stood over him, calm, collected, in control. I trained them myself, she said, her tone almost conversational. You probably think they're just some attack dogs, but they're not. They're trained from Awaru. They've taken down men twice your size, men with weapons, men with better reflexes than you. Scarface whimpered, his cocky demeanor gone. Look, I wasn't gonna. Shut up. He shut up. She crouched beside him, her face now inches from his. You followed a pregnant woman, home. You planned to do God knows what. And now, you're learning a lesson. Scarface swallowed hard. Olivia studied him for a moment, then exhaled. You're lucky I'm not who I used to be. Her mind flickered back. To the war zones, to the covert missions, to the days when men like him never walked away. She wasn't that person anymore. She had Daniel's voice in the back of her head. Violence is easy. Knowing when to walk away, that's harder. A part of her still ached at the thought of him, but she knew what he would tell her now. This isn't worth it. She stood, snapped her fingers. Ghost immediately released Scarface and stepped back, though his eyes never left him. Scarface scrambled to his feet, stumbling as he backed away. You're crazy, lady. Olivia tilted her head, amused. Am I? He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and bolted, nearly tripping over himself in his desperation to escape. Olivia watched him go, her expression unreadable. He won't come back. He was a coward, and cowards only preyed on those they thought were weaker. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. She let out a slow breath and turned back to her SUV. Ghost and Rex were already waiting for her, their tails wagging slightly, not out of excitement, but as if to say, we did our job. She scratched behind Ghost's ears before sliding back into the driver's seat. The night was quiet again, but Olivia knew this wasn't the last challenge she'd face, because men like Scarface were everywhere, and she'd be damned if she let the world see her as a victim. She was a fighter, a mother, A survivor. And she had a pact to prove it. The silence of the empty parking lot stretched as Olivia sat behind the wheel, her hands still gripping the steering wheel long after Scarface had fled. Her pulse was steady now, but her mind wasn't. Something about tonight didn't sit right with her. She had encountered plenty of men like Scarface before, arrogant, violent, looking for an easy win. But something about his persistence, the way he had followed her long after his friends, had backed off, gnawed at her instincts. He wasn't just some low-life thug looking for trouble. He had been determined. And determination like that? It usually had a reason. Ghost let out a low whine, his eyes still fixed on the road as if expecting trouble to return. Rex huffed from the back seat, settling down but still on high alert. "Yeah, boys," she muttered, shifting into drive. "I don't like this either." She didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove in a loop, checking the mirrors every few minutes. No tail, no lurking cars. But that didn't mean she was safe. The time she finally pulled into her driveway, the night had deepened. The porch light flickered on as she stepped out, the house feeling eerily quiet in the aftermath of adrenaline. She had spent years preparing for situations like this: combat zones, high-risk missions, urban warfare. And yet, something about tonight made her skin prickle. She locked the doors, reset the security system, and moved through the house, checking every window. Ghost and Rex followed, their ears twitching at every creak of the wooden floors. Her gut told her something wasn't over yet, and her gut was never wrong. The next morning, Olivia was in the middle of her training session with Ghost and Rex when she noticed it. A sleek black SUV parked across the street, just far enough to seem innocent but too conspicuous to be an accident. She played it cool, kept training, kept watching. 15 minutes later, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, not Scarface. Someone worse. Olivia's stomach twisted as she recognized him instantly. Detective Marcus Lyle, corrupt, ruthless. A man whose name was whispered among those who had the misfortune of crossing him. And now, he was here, watching her. She wiped the sweat from her brow and straightened as he walked toward the fence. He was dressed in plain clothes, but she wasn't fooled. This wasn't a social visit. "Ms. Carter," Lyle greeted, his voice too smooth, too practiced. "Busy morning?" Olivia gave him a long look before answering. "Something like that." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if we talk?" She crossed her arms. "Depends. You here officially or unofficially?" Lyle chuckled. "Unofficially, of course." Olivia said nothing. She wasn't about to make this easy for him. Lyle sighed as if disappointed. "I heard you had a little altercation last night. Something about a man following you?" She tensed. News travels fast, especially when certain people go missing. A cold weight settled in Olivia's chest. Missing? Scarface ran away. She had watched him go. There was no way. Unless he hadn't made it home. Olivia forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lyle studied her, tapping his fingers against the metal fence. "You sure? Because I have witnesses who say otherwise. Say they saw you with two very large, very aggressive dogs. Say they saw you teaching someone a lesson." Her jaw clenched. "If someone followed me home with bad intentions, I handled it the way I was trained to. I didn't kill him." Lyle's smile widened. "Did I say anything about killing?" The trap snapped shut. She knew what this was now. This wasn't about Scarface. This wasn't even about last night. This was about her coup. Someone had put a target on her back, and Lyle was here to make sure she understood that. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening into fists. "You have something to say, Detective. Say it." Lyle leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You should be careful, Ms. Carter. People like you, people who make the wrong enemies, they don't last long in this city." Olivia stared him down, unblinking. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." For the first time, something flickered in Lyle's eyes. Uncertainty, just for a second. Then he grinned. "Enjoy your day, Ms. Carter." He turned, walked back to his SUV, and drove off. Olivia watched until the taillights disappeared. Then she exhaled. She didn't go inside, didn't stop moving. She grabbed her phone, dialed a number she hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Carter?" She swallowed. "I need a favor." Silence. Then, "How bad?" "Bad." A pause. Then, "I'll be there in an hour." She hung up, her pulse finally slowing. If Lyle thought she was an easy target, if whoever was pulling the strings thought she would roll over, they were about to learn the hard way, because Olivia Carter wasn't running. She was fighting back. The moment Olivia hung up the phone, a strange calm settled over her. The kind that came right before a storm. She knew what was coming. Lyle's warning hadn't been a warning. It was a threat. He had made it clear that she had stepped on the wrong toes, but he hadn't expected her to push back. That was his mistake. He thought she was just another civilian. But Olivia Carter had never been a civilian. Not really. The next hour passed in tense silence. She checked the locks, loaded the last of her emergency supplies into her go bag, and ran through the worst case scenarios in her head. If they came tonight, she wouldn't be caught off guard. Then headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. Ghost and Rex stirred, ears perked, eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. Olivia stepped outside, exhaling as the car door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man emerged, his movements deliberate, measured. Caleb Bishop, former intelligence officer. One of the few people Olivia still trusted. The moment his gaze met hers, she knew he understood. "You're in trouble," he said, voice low, scanning the perimeter with the practiced ease of a man who had seen too many battlefields. She nodded. "It's Lyle." His jaw tightened. "How bad?" She folded her arms. "Missing guy. False accusations. And Lyle making house calls." Caleb let out a slow breath. "They want to bury you." "Looks that way." A pause. Then he glanced at the dogs. "You think they'll come for you here?" "They'll try." He nodded once, then with no hesitation he said, "Then we make sure they fail." The next morning, Olivia stood in front of the police precinct, heart pounding but her face unreadable. Caleb had spent the night digging through his old contacts, finding the missing pieces she needed, and what he had uncovered? It was bigger than she had imagined. Scarface, whose real name was Eric Vasquez, wasn't just some thug. He had been working for Lyle, running drugs, threatening witnesses, silencing people who got too close to the truth. And now, Eric Vasquez was dead, not missing. Dead. And Lyle was framing her for it. Olivia stepped inside, walking past officers, who gave her wary glances. She wasn't just some former canine trainer anymore. She was a problem, a loose end that needed tying up. Too bad for them. She wasn't here to surrender. She was here to burn the whole thing down. The interrogation room was cold. Olivia sat with her hands folded neatly on the metal table. Ghost, and Rex waiting outside with Caleb. Across from her sat Lyle, his smirk infuriatingly confident. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I really thought you were smarter than this." She didn't respond. He sighed dramatically. "This is how it works, Carter. You step out of line, you get corrected. You make the wrong enemies, you disappear. It's nothing personal." Olivia tilted her head. "You think I'm scared?" Lyle chuckled. "No, but you should be." She held his gaze for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly. "You know what I think, Detective?" His smirk faltered just a fraction. "I think you're used to winning. I think you've spent years getting away with this. Burying bodies, silencing people who get in your way." She let her voice drop, sharp as a blade. "And I think you have no idea what's coming." Lyle exhaled, shaking his head. "Lady, you're running out of time. The second they charge you with Vasquez's murder, you're done, she smiled. Then you'd better hurry up. His eyes narrowed. Then the door swung open. Another officer stepped inside, looking pale. Sir, there's a problem. Lyle frowned. What kind of problem? The officer swallowed hard. A warrant. For you. Silence. Lyle's expression froze. What? The officer hesitated, then placed a folder on the table. Caleb Bishop handed over evidence this morning. Bank records, witness testimonies, audio recordings. The officer's voice was tight, controlled. It's over, sir. Lyle's hands clenched into fists. You... Olivia leaned back, exhaling slowly. The game was over. By the time Olivia stepped out of the station, the sun was high in the sky. Caleb was waiting by the car, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. It's done? He asked. She nodded. Lyle's done. They have enough to put him away for life. Caleb studied her for a moment. And you? She hesitated. Because the truth was, she didn't know. She had spent so long fighting, surviving, keeping her head above water. Now that the storm had passed, now that the immediate danger was gone, she wasn't sure what came next. Caleb must have seen it in her face because he sighed. You know, you don't always have to be in a war zone, she scoffed. That's funny coming from you. He smirked. Yeah, well, I'm working on it. She glanced down at Ghost and Rex, who were watching her expectantly, tails wagging slightly. Her boys, her family. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe it was time to stop looking over her shoulder. She exhaled. Come on. Let's go home. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way Olivia hadn't experienced in years. With Lyle arrested and the department scrambling to clean house, the threats stopped. No more shadowy figures watching her house. No more tension in every interaction. She could breathe again. And yet, a part of her still felt restless. One evening, as she sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Caleb joined her. You. Thinking about leaving? He asked casually, taking a sip of his beer. She considered lying, but what was the point? Yeah. He nodded as if he had already known. Where? She shrugged. Somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. She paused, glancing at the 2 dogs lying at her feet. Somewhere my boys can run, free, Caleb chuckled. Sounds nice. She smiled. Yeah, it does. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke again. You deserve peace, Olivia. She swallowed hard. I don't know if I'd recognize it. He turned to her, his expression softer than she had ever seen. Then maybe it's time to find out. A month later, Olivia stood at the edge of a sprawling property, the scent of pine and fresh earth filling the air. Her new home. It wasn't much yet. A small house, a fenced field, land stretching beyond the horizon. But it was hers. Ghost and Rex raced ahead, barking joyfully, tails wagging. Watching them, she felt something stir in her chest, something warm, something new. For the first time in a long time, Olivia Carter wasn't just surviving, she was living. And this was just the beginning.